Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm again exceedingly pleased to welcome Jeffrey Augustine. Hi, Jeff.
Hello, John. The pleasure is mine, good sir.
Yeah, well, we'll mutually experience pleasure.
Yeah.
I want to say before we go any further that I've spent a long time studying Scientology, almost 50 years now. It's really terrible, isn't it? And there are people who have the attitude that I know something about it. I learned a great deal in our last conversation. So I just want to underline that the respect that I have. Kudos to you for your scholarship in this matter.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Right, so this is our second part. We got up to Volney Matheson in part one.
Yes, we did.
Do you want to pick up from there? The history of the Hubbard electropsychometer.
Yes, to reiterate.
There was one point actually that somebody brought up. Somebody in the comments said that it's probably not a galvanometer, but an ohm meter. So could you address that point first for us?
That's subject to terminology.
Exactly.
It meant ohms or resistance.
Yeah.
Is used in electrical circuits. So you could say technically it's an ohm meter, but the departure, when you go into the human body, it's measuring resistance in the human body. So if you consider the human body a circuit, I suppose you could say that. I wouldn't be inclined to call it an ohm meter, but I understand what they're saying.
Well, I think that addresses it.
I mean, it's someone who's obviously been around engineering would make that comment, and I can understand why they would call it an ohm meter. But because we're dealing with the human body, resistance in the human body and nervous system, it's a little different. Normally, just in terminology, an ohm meter is used on hardware. Yeah, we're dealing with the body, and that. So we'll leave it at that. I take your point. That's fair. That's fair. Yeah. But let's reiterate. What we're saying is that in the last part one, I said that the emeter is agnostic. It measures galvanic skin resistance in the human body. Every human body has galvanic skin resistance. That means that the electrical conductivity of your skin, and it is important to keep it in skin, changes in relationship to your psychological states. So when you're anxious, the conductivity of resistance changes. So the resistance to the flow of electrical current in your skin can go up and down. And this is bioelectricity, biophysiology. So we're dealing with very low levels. But the body is electrical in nature. We know nerve impulses, the brain are electrical in nature. Yeah. Bioelectrical. And so that's what we're dealing with. And so because the emeter is agnostic, it doesn't care whether you're a Christian, Jew, atheist, whatever, right? So you can use the emeter in any ideological or philosophical or religious construct. It's like a car. A car doesn't care whether you're going to Disneyland, whether you're robbing a bank, it going to church. It doesn't care. The car doesn't care where it's going. It can be used for anything. And that's important. That's why when I say it's agnostic, it's just like a car. Yeah. So if you want to go shopping to the store, or you're going to go kidnapping, looting, or you're going to pick up your friend at the airport, the car does not care what it does. It's the same thing with the emeter. It doesn't care what it reads because it can only read galvanic skin resistance. Yeah. A car can only drive. And because it's a machine, it doesn't have any morality about it. It can be used. So that's Hubbard's genius was to see. We talked about how Dianetics didn't use an emeter at all. It was talking. And then when Hubbard saw what the emeter can do, he was able to superimpose his Dianetics construct and use the emeter to prove that Dianetics was true because it read on the meter. So a couple things I want to get into. The current emeter patent for the, I think it's called the Mark 8 Ultra something, the Mark 8 Ultra emeter, their current one. The US patent, it says it's basically called an improved device for indicating and measuring small variations in the resistance of a living body. So that's what it does. And this is on the current patent. It's patent number 8121676B2. And the inventor is Ron Hubbard, Starkey's representative, and a few other inventors. The Church of Spiritual Technology is the assignee of the patent.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, and not RTC.
Hmm.
Now in this document, which I'll get into later, they say that Hubbard's the principal inventor, and they don't cite the prior art of only Matheson or others.
Hmm.
And there's sort of a bait and switch in here where they take away all prior art and patent, which I think is very intellectually dishonest. And it's also a matter I could take it with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office back in 2012, but why bother? Hubbard's not doing that.
Let's say, I've done a lot of work on where Hubbard got his ideas from,
Mm-hmm.
and he was an incredible plagiarist. Book One, Dianetics, is found almost whole before the First World War and dismissed by Freud. It was the original technique used by Joseph Breuer on Anna von O in the late 1880s, I would think. And Freud dismisses it in a lecture in Worcester, Massachusetts, because he says, and he pretty much describes the techniques. He talks about counting people back. The word charge is used for what you're relieving. Emotional trauma is not the only thing. Hubbard would claim to be the first person to have added physical trauma, the engram, but Freud actually talks about it there.
Yeah.
And he dismisses it because it doesn't work. That what it does is it makes people more dependent upon the therapist. It may make them feel euphoric, but it makes them more dependent on the therapist. And the whole stated intention of Freudian therapy, I'm afraid they never got there, is to resolve the transference, which is to say to bring somebody out of the kind of childhood attachment they have to people all around them and help them grow up and have an adult attachment, which would mean that you are self-determined in Hubbard's terms, would mean that you are making the decisions for yourself and you're not being stimulated and triggered by past experiences that come from infancy and childhood. So Hubbard steals that technique. If we go into 1952, the point where he makes the break with Dianetics because he loses it, and suddenly Scientology comes out of nowhere, the initial techniques for Scientology are visualization techniques, which he calls creative processing. These techniques come directly from Aleister Crowley, and he refers to Crowley, of course, in the Philadelphia doctorate course lectures as his very good friend.
Yes.
So we have a connection there, and we know that he was practicing Crowleyite magic before. But the same with the emeter, that while in the book Science of Survival, the book Scientology 8008, Hubbard gives a great long list of the people from whom he has apparently taken ideas. I've not found out what Anaxagoras actually contributed, but he's in there. He will later on, of course, claim that everything is his, all major discoveries are his. And the reality is, not one of them is. Not one single foundational idea is Hubbard's. And the same is true, as you've demonstrated in the earlier talk, about the emeter. It's not a Hubbard patent. Hubbard had no idea about electricity and electronics. He shows no facility in this subject anywhere. And indeed, as soon as he gets into physics, I've told this story many times, Brown McKee, who was 24 years involved with Scientology, was a physicist. And he said, I knew that everything he said about physics was nonsense because I'm a physicist. But what he said about Buddhism was really interesting. You and I came to it and said, I know what he's saying about Buddhism is nonsense, but what he's saying about other things is interesting. So he was not a scientist. He was not a nuclear physicist. He was a con artist fundamentally.
Yeah, it's interesting. And what I lay out in my history of the emeter on my blog, Scientology Money Project, here's a couple things that happened real quick. And by way of background, having been in corporate for 30 years, I've also been involved in metaphysics and spirituality all my life.
Yeah, me too.
Evasha Vedanta, Buddhism, and I am a dreaded Freemason. I might add, I have the degree of 32nd degree Mason and Knight Templar.
Okay.
And it's not unusual for people who've been in Freemasonry a long time to have both of those degrees from the Scottish Rite and the York Rite.
Okay.
And it is interesting to have an engineering background along with a metaphysical background.
Mm.
And
in fact, it's the basic claim that Hubbard made, isn't it? He studied with gurus in the East, which is not at all true, and that he was a nuclear physicist and he combined these two things, which is such a fascinating idea, but was a complete lie in his case.
Yeah, and there's those of us who've actually done the work. I'm not a degreed engineer, but I knew how to, in high tech, I knew how to close sales, and I had to be very conversant with physics and engineering, and I was fortunate to have very generous colleagues who would explain it to me.
Yes.
And I've self-published a book called What Caused the Big Bang, which we could talk about on another show.
Oh, let's do that. That'd be good fun. The collapse of an 11-dimensional P membrane into three dimensions, if I've remembered properly.
Well, it's based on an experience I had when I was a young man. So, so Hubbard is an opportunist.
Hmm.
Here's a couple things that happened leading up to the emeter. Once Volney, we talked about how Volney Matheson went to a presentation Hubbard was giving in Los Angeles on Dianetics. Volney Matheson had some horrible life experiences in the late 1940s. In the old movie theaters, they used carbon arc, that would burn down on a projector to the film would run in front of the carbon arc, right? And that would light the screen. Now, carbon arc became outdated. The Germans in World War II, actually Osram, a company I worked for, they invented the spotlight, so they would get British bombers in, when they were bombing. And these were based on xenon plasma. And so this World War II German spotlight technology was incorporated brilliantly into theater projectors.
Okay.
Volney Matheson had put a lot of time into regulating a carbon arc, which was by then was like a horse and buggy whip. He lost a lot of money. He thought he was going to cash out, and a new technology just decimated him. And he was depressed. And so he was looking for his own answers, and he developed the electrogalvanometer and called it the electropsychometer, right? And he was using it not only on himself, but he was developing auditing procedures, Technique 100 and other techniques. So basically, Volney Matheson handed Hubbard this plug-and-play system, and Hubbard saw that he would be able to plug in Dianetics into it. It is brilliant electronic machine, and Hubbard took to it. Now, at the same time, Hubbard saw that Dianetics was cratering. He probably took by my calculations, he took about $1 million cash out of the Dianetics Foundation.
Yeah. And
there's a story where he goes in and takes out about, in today's money, about $500,000 in cash. And A.E. Van Vogt, they called him and said, "What here?" Because he was on the Hubbard, he was on the board, and they said, "Mr. Hubbard's here. He wants to take out, I think it was 86,000. Then it's 500,000 now." And Van Vogt said, "He's the boss. Let him do it." So Hubbard, I think he had about $1 million set aside. I think his game plan was to bankrupt Dianetics, reboot using the emeter, and leave Don Purcell holding the bag. He just didn't see that Don Purcell would buy out the rights to Dianetics for $6,100 in bankruptcy. But you can trace the chain of events where he has a meeting. There's a meeting at the Dianetics Foundation in Wichita where Hubbard resigns and tenders his shares back. Purcell puts it into bankruptcy. Hubbard takes off to Wichita.
Yeah.
But that day before he left, he first, as far as I can tell, that was the first time he showed the emeter to Dianeticists. He introduced it.
During I think there was a slip there. You said he takes off to Wichita. He takes off to Phoenix. Yeah, from Wichita.
Sorry, yes, I meant Phoenix. Yeah. So he and Susie, Mary Sue, are all ready to take off to Phoenix to start Scientology because he had already copyrighted the name. So he was laying down his exit strategy out of Dianetics. And the basis of it was the emeter and the new term Scientology. And Scientology was going to be addressing the spirit. Now let's go back. In Dianetics, one of the things that caused a falling out in the Dianetics Foundation was when they were running people through prenatals, through birth. That was the firewall in early Dianetics. We could take you back to birth. Okay, that's where it stopped. But then people began having past life recalls, and Hubbard allowed that to happen.
I think Hubbard promoted it. I mean, he talks about it in Science of Survival in 51. But there's a little clue, and that is that most people talk about reincarnation or even metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. The term past lives was used by Aleister Crowley, and Hubbard picks up in many places. He picks up Crowley's view, and in fact, even the trauma of birth Crowley has talked about, and Crowley was dead by 1947, so there's no danger of it being Hubbard getting there first. So the way that, when in rereading Science of Survival, my thought is that he's pushing his own ideas in, just as he did with the Church of Scientology, that he registered it in Camden, New Jersey in December 1953. The registrations, I think, are still available. I've got copies of them. And then forever afterwards, he'll claim that it was Burton Faber in February 1954 who had this idea. But of course, we also can trace back the April 10th, 53 letter to Helen O'Brien saying, what do you think of the religion angle? So he tends to, anything that might be unpopular, he blames on somebody else. He says this was somebody else's idea. So how many people were actually running past lives? I don't know. I know that A. Van Vogt never took to the idea and spent the rest of his life, not writing any more fiction, very sadly, because he was a brilliant writer, dedicated his life. I corresponded with him in the early 80s. Dedicated his life to Dianetics, but he and the California Association of Dianetic Auditors, who of course retained the earliest trademark on the word Dianetics until they finally gave it up, I think, in the late 1980s. They too were not really keen on this. That this was going off into religious, spiritual, weird territory rather than sticking with, materialistic, reductionist science, which is what they wanted to do. Let's go back to the business angle, because we're going to be wending our way through both metaphysics and business in this conversation we're having. So the firewall was conception, because Hubbard talks in his early work about sperm sequences, sperm dream. Yeah, the sperm dream. And being in the womb, being an egg, and then seeing the sperm coming at you, I guess. How you'd be seeing if you're an egg, we don't know, but Ron Hubbard had a vivid imagination.
But in terms of, like, if you stopped Dianetics at conception, you're not going to make any money. If you have the insight that, hey, let them run with past lives all they want for millions of years, billions of years, trillions of years, you're going to make a lot more money letting people basically do what Freud would call free association. If they want to talk about being burned alive during the Inquisition, during the Spanish Inquisition, and they're on the clock and they're paying you, have at it. If you were on a Martian implant station 50 million years ago, good, I want to hear all about it. And this is where Hubbard's particular genius comes in. He says, do not evaluate for the pre-clear. In other words, you could say, look, if they want to talk about anything and we're getting paid, let them talk about anything. And so the scientists that, Dr. Winter and the other scientific types in the Dianetics Foundation said, we don't want to go into past lives. And Hubbard's thinking, we can make a lot of money going here, or I can make a lot of money going here. So I think I need to start an exit strategy to dump you guys, because metaphysics, you can make a lot more money than we can stopping at conception and prenatals and all that.
And I mean, the other thing that has to be said is it was not working. That people, the original supporters, John Campbell Jr., Art Sepos, Dr. Joe Winter, they'd had spontaneous remission of certain conditions, and then the conditions came back. So, the sinusitis that Campbell suffered from, he had a few days after this is something, when I interviewed Don Rogers, who was on the board of every foundation through to, I think, 1954, he stayed with Hubbard. He was there through the development of Dianetics. And one of the surprising things that he said, and the letters he wrote to me are all available on Tony Ortega's site. One of the really surprising things was that when the book was commissioned, right at the beginning of 1950, it was written very quickly, as Hubbard says, Hubbard turned to him and said, well, hypnosis isn't really very popular, so we're going to have to find a new approach. So the book was written talking about reverie, the term commonly used by hypnotists at the time for the light trance, where you're not kind of completely out, you appear to be in the room and talking. And Hubbard knew that that's what he was doing. So he moved from using a deep trance form, which was not particularly different from any other hypnotherapy that was being practiced, into this new way of doing it, which is in fact exactly what Freud had used. Freud, having studied with Charcot in Paris, had learned hypnosis and would rail against hypnosis, never understand the distinction between a full-on trance hypnosis and the light trance, which very brilliant people like Milton Erickson could use to tremendous effect. And what you're finding is, just as in faith healing, that people will have these incredible feelings, that all this adrenaline will come up and they'll be able to get up out of their wheelchair. And then about 3 days later, it comes back again. And Dianetics had that sort of effect, that the 100, 200,000 people who did it in that first year, pretty much all of them, the spontaneous remission went away. So it wasn't working. So he needed something else. He needed to sell something else.
Well, yeah, and certainly, just to digress, Billy Graham Evangelistic Association found this, when they had Dr. Graham had a rally, revival rally, more than 50% of people a year later lost their faith. People who came forward to make a confession of Christ as their Savior, they wouldn't stay around. That's been a persistent problem because people have this tremendous cathartic experience of being saved. And then a year later, they're back, smoking, drinking, sinning, going on with life as usual. But that also happens in a lot of other fields where there's that initial cathartic mountaintop experience that diminishes.
Yes.
So we've seen that in a lot of fields. What's interesting to me, so Hubbard's making an exit strategy to leave Dianetics, and you can see what he's doing. He's taking a lot of money out of the foundation. In fact, that last he took $9,600, which is about $85,000 in today's dollars. He wrote a check. And this is why when he's giving a lecture, when he leaves Dianetics, he's in Philadelphia giving a lecture, and the marshal comes in and arrests him.
Yep.
Well, that's because Don Purcell pressed charges. He didn't have the right to cash a check for $85,000 after he left, and he had to pay that back. And that's brilliantly recreated in the movie The Master.
Yeah.
His arrest. So Hubbard put away, like I said, I think about $1 million to launch Scientology. He plundered the Dianetics Foundation. He goes to Phoenix and sets it up with the emeter. Matheson's in along for the ride. And in fact, Matheson, it's still called the Matheson electropsychometer in Phoenix. And now in 1952, the Journal of Scientology, Hubbard has a paper which is posted online, and we'll put it in the show notes. He says electronics gives life to Freud's theory. And he writes, L. Hubbard, quote, years after free association as developed by Sigmund Freud has been abandoned as a therapy, the development in electronics has revised, at least in part, the techniques of the Viennese master. Oh, really? he goes on to say, in the days when none could expect a great deal from psychotherapy, Sigmund Freud introduced the advance of free association. In this technique, the patient was permitted to discourse freely and wanderingly until the doctor could gain a clue as to the source of his trouble. Well, Hubbard goes on to say, years later, the technique is made workable for the first time by the development of an electronic instrument, the electropsychometer, which was invented by Volney Matheson of California. So here, Hubbard gives it all away.
Mm.
He's using free association at this point in Scientology. In other words, free association, Freud allowed people to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about.
Yep.
Hubbard, realizing that there's a lot of money to be made in this free association, allows them to do the same thing, but he puts them on a meter.
Mm.
So when they're talking about something, then the meter moves. He could say that, what's that? And then he claims to be dialing in on that area of charge or upset, psychic disturbance, travail. And what Hubbard was interested in, and Scientology is still interested in, is what's called erasure. Hubbard believed that by methodically going through on the meter on a traumatic incident, it would erase from the reactive mind. So you would attain erasure. And that's what he was after early on. And the model became, if you could go through and methodically and systematically erase everything, you would attain the state of clear.
And there's a contradiction already in this idea. He's created this notion of the analytical mind and the reactive mind. And on the one hand, we're trying to delete things, erase things from reactive mind. But early on, he's talking about those things refiling in the analytical mind. But there is some confusion in that, because one of the ideas that's put forward, and I don't have the reference in my head here, is the idea that you won't be able to remember these things after you've deleted them, after you've erased them. So rather than, we in the original Dianetic model, you even had a little file clerk who was running around in there like a character in a Terry Pratchett novel, moving things between. And of course, it all relies on the idea that memory is based in mental image pictures, which are taken curiously at the same rate as movie film, 1/24th of a second per image. And you get this idea, you've been around here for 1.25 quadrillion years, and you've been keeping this damn record of this thing all this time. There must be a certain amount of mass, even if these things are trivially insignificant at 24th of a second. If you've had 1.25 quadrillion years, and I thought a quadrillion was a kind of dance, I'm apparently wrong about that. It's a Hubbard invention. You have a billion, which is 1,000 million. And that takes us, back to the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years. Hubbard then expands to a trillion as an order of magnitude, and then to a quadrillion when you get into the upper level materials. That's an enormous amount of mental image pictures that you've got to be carrying around with you and shifting around. And it seems like an incredibly unnecessary process for an all-knowing being to be bothering. And, by history of man, he's talking about, these sacks of pictures being loaded onto you from other thetans and all of this stuff. It does gets fairly extreme and Byzantine in its complexity. But we are meant to be, by going through and through incidents, we are meant to bring our tone level up so that emotionally we go from, being completely traumatized to being absolutely exhilarated and serene about the horrible things that have happened to us, if we can indeed remember them, which we're not sure we can or not. It's very interesting. I think one of the fascinating things, soon after I left Scientology, I went, I've got this. What you do is you promise people everything they ever wanted. You are a superhuman. You are a godlike being. In fact, you are only one stage lower than me, Ron Hubbard, because you'll never be able to perceive reality well enough to develop any technology. Only I can do that. So I'm a god maker, but you're a god, and you know everything, and you just tell people this complete nonsense. And we went for it. We went for the idea that this was really the truth about us. And there is, you use the word genius about him, and I balk at thinking of Ron Hubbard as a genius, because as with most sociopaths, he's incredibly cunning, but he's incredibly intellectually lazy. He's not somebody who, he can't really read a book from beginning to end without getting bored. He has an attention deficit disorder going on there. So you get this strange thing that he hits on some idea, some simple idea, like saying, let's tell people that they're perfect and we can remove their imperfections. And we'll do this by deleting trauma and refiling it as something that's amusing. I mean, one little comment on that, I was talking to a man who I'm not going to name because what he said appalled me so much that I don't want to destroy his reputation, but he is quite well known, this man, in the counter-cult field. And he put forward the idea that if a soldier cries at the thought of his fallen comrades, that he hasn't dealt with the trauma. And that reminded me so strongly of Ron Hubbard. And it's such an argument against this idea of refiling trauma. When you think about, your lost parents or your lost friends, you should feel sad. It's the proper feeling to have. You shouldn't be overwhelmed, but it should be a poignant moment. So the idea that you're going to be cheerfully gleeful about, the loss of a friend in a train crash or something like that, it's just a stupid idea.
Yeah, it is. It is. And going back to what you said, when I speak of Hubbard's genius can be diabolical, cunning.
Yeah,
so maybe
that's why I accept the word.
Point. You could speak of Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos. She had a certain cunning genius to swindle people, including Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, who also is an evil genius.
Yeah, and me being, of course, a Mason, some people think that I call Hank Kissinger every morning. We make plans to run the world. If you read some of my detractors online, it's amusing to me. That's why I work every day, because I'm Illuminati and I run the world. But anyway, no, Hubbard was able to do a couple things. He by not evaluating for the pre-clear, and I've used this example before, and I like it because it's vivid. If you came up in mind, if you were in a Scientology auditing session and you came up with a blue kangaroo on the moon is your item, like you're having trouble with a blue kangaroo on the moon, Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard would not evaluate for you. They would say, tell me about the blue kangaroo on the moon. And you would describe the blue kangaroo on the moon. Now, the fact that kangaroos could not live on the moon because there's no oxygen is immaterial. The fact that there are not blue kangaroos in nature is immaterial. But nevertheless, they allow you to go on. And I think it's known in psychology that and I think this was Carl Jung and others noted it early on, that treating things, treating imaginal content can sometimes give as much relief as treating actual trauma, treating imagination. And one of Carl Jung's disciples, James Hillman, whose work I really like, he talks about treating the imaginal. And that's a field that psychotherapy has entered into, treating the imaginal. What are your imaginal fears? They're normally associated with children, but adults have them, and they often are. In Hubbard's time, it was a fear of nuclear destruction. And Hubbard really dialed into the psychosis of the time that was both existential and imaginal. So Hubbard was somewhat of a deft cultural parrot. That is, he would take things in the paper and parrot them. Just like he would take, names out of Will and Ariel Durant's history, and he would repeat them as if he were a historian. Or he would take little, incorrect snippets of science and quote them.
Even the word Dianetics, doubtless the netics part comes from cybernetics, because that was so popular at the time. So, and he'll, exactly as you say, he'll grab an idea. I sort of think of him as somebody who reads the Boy's Own books and the Reader's Digest, and then grabs an idea and pretends to be an authority in a subject area where he really knows nothing. So, for example, the book All About Radiation, if you give that to anybody who's actually studied physics, they'll be sort of, oh dear, what he has to say about gamma rays and their penetrative power. He doesn't know what he's talking about, but he's read an article somewhere. Or when he talks about penicillin, for example, he's read an article somewhere, when that one little bulletin where he talks about neuron synapses, as if he understands how the brain functions.
Sure.
There's nothing behind it. He's just somebody he's learned the words. There's a sociologist whose name eludes me at the moment, who's in one of the University of Cardiff or Swansea in Wales, and he published a paper having gone to a convention of physicists, and all he did was repeat words back to people. And by the end of the convention, people were saying what a brilliant man he was. He'd walked in with no understanding of physics whatsoever. So Hubbard's like that, as you say, he parroted things.
Yeah, it's funny, a story. I was talking to a customer once. He was a purchasing agent, which are he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. He was a nice guy, but we were talking about Star Wars, and Star Wars. So we were talking about laser weapons. So I worked on lasers, and he wanted to know about laser weapons in space and Star Wars. And, we were going into warp speed, which is, warp speed, of course, is going faster than light. So warp 3 would be 3 times the speed of light, right?
Just fairly clear.
And he was talking about a spaceship shooting lasers at each other. And I said, well, all you would do to outrun lasers is go to warp 2 or 3 or higher. As long as you're moving faster than the speed of light, a laser couldn't catch you. He goes, yeah, laser is the fastest, light's the fastest thing in the universe.
Uh-huh.
I said, correct, but if you were moving faster than light, it couldn't get you. And neither could a bullet. If you were going faster than a bullet, it couldn't get you. And it dawns on him. And it was just one of those funny things about some people's understanding of physics are very limited. Hubbard had no real understanding of physics or science. But he tells a story that this is one of the most funny things. He tells a story, in one of his lectures, where he's saying that Dianetics has a viewpoint of space as dimension.
Space is a viewpoint of dimension, axiom 4 of Scientology.
Yes, space is a viewpoint of dimension. So he said one of his boys, Wing Angel, who was an actual Scientologist.
With a great name.
Wing Angel, yes.
Rocky Stump was another with a fantastic name. What are you going to do with these people?
So Hubbard says, one of our boys, Wing Angel, was up at a scientific laboratory talking to a scientist. And this scientist said, well, does, Scientology have a viewpoint of space? And Wing Angel says what is the viewpoint of dimension?
Space is a viewpoint of dimension, which is a completely meaningless tautology.
It's just babble.
Yeah.
And so as Hubbard relates the story, Wing Angel tells him the Scientology data, and the scientist pauses and looks shocked, and then picks up the phone and says, "Shut down number 7." And then Hubbard says, once he realized what space was, he realized he had an experiment running that if he hadn't shut it down, it would have blown up the entire factory. And this is the most, this is the stupidest thing. Like a scientist, a Scientologist saved a factory from blowing up itself and maybe causing a chain reaction that would destroy the whole world, because he suddenly understood what space was from L. Ron Hubbard. And Hubbard later, of course, in keeping Scientology working, says, why I was chosen to rise above the bank, we will not go into. So, anyway, but back to free association. Okay, so from Scientology starts in 54, technically. It starts earlier.
He first used the term in February 52.
Yeah.
And it becomes a church in 54.
Right. He copyrighted the term prior to leaving Dianetics. So that's why I say he had an exit strategy in mind to take a whole bunch of money, dump the debt onto Purcell, move on. So we've got that done. And then he admits that it is, in 52, he's saying that Scientology is Freudian free association plus the emeter. It's all here in black and white. So we'll post it in the so you can see it on the screen. And that's very interesting. That's just him saying what it is, and then that's on my blog. Now, jumping ahead, so we have galvanic skin resistance is what it's doing. Now, here's what my I think a breakthrough in my work is, John. If I can talk about my work.
Absolutely, you can. That's what you're here to do.
This is where we're in business and metaphysics. Okay, now Hubbard has committed all of Scientology to the emeter. He's locked in. And one thing Hubbard says in the Simon Bolivar policy is you always have to be giving them a new game, or the game becomes getting you.
Yeah.
This is very insightful. He knew he always had to be giving Scientologists a new game, or the game would become getting him.
Which it has become, of course.
Well, this shows Hubbard knows the calculus of power and manipulation.
No.
I don't underestimate him. His successor, Miscavige, is not even worthy of being estimated. He's an idiot.
He does not seem to be tremendously intelligent, I must say.
The Commodore was many things, and he could be an idiot. He knew power and he knew brutality. So he's a different animal. Okay, so Hubbard's irrevocably committed to the emeter and to the state of clear, right? Now here's my theory on the OT levels of body thetans. Hubbard has a couple problems. He needs, when he was writing Pulp Fiction, he got paid a penny a word. So that was a losing game, right? The real money for him was in royalties. So he knew he made a lot more money on a book getting royalties. So that's why when he created Dianetics and Scientology, his real money came from royalties and selling books. And that's why so much of Scientology, so much of his administrative series is on selling books, because he pocketed royalties. So now when clear topped out, once you hit clear, just as I said, the firewall in Dianetics was conception, he had to go past lives or whole track to make more money. Correct?
Yep.
So if you top out on the other side, if your firewall is clear and you can't go any further, you're not going to make any more money. And people are going to be bored. They're going to want a new game. I'm clear. What do I do now? Do I go into some other practice? Do I go into Buddhism? No. So Hubbard has a couple problems. And here's how he solves them. In order to get copyright, he has to create something that can be audited that is not an engram. He has to have a source or an origin point for this next thing. So this is why I think Incident 2 of OT3, in which Xenu took all of these people from other planets, dumped them into volcanoes, blew them up, and they became body thetans, which are clustered to us. This actually solves a lot of problems for Hubbard. And here's what it does, in my thinking. First, he has an origin point that body thetans are traceable to. Xenu, who's a character in Scientology cosmology, right? So you have an actual origin point for all the body thetans. They're blown up in the principal volcanoes of Earth. And then they go out and then they cluster to all of us. So when they're body thetans, they're on the human skin. Therefore, they can be read by galvanic skin resistance. So in terms of engineering, he has engrams come into body thetans because they both can read on the meter. He has to stay on the human body or skin so it can read on the emeter. I think that was his real solution.
Okay.
I think it was a really hidden, clever solution so he could keep it within the meter, because galvanic skin resistance is the undisclosed engine of Scientology. It's what drives the meter, is galvanic skin resistance. So why not create a story? Because the power of authorship is you can create a story and people who are inclined to believe whatever you say will believe that. And it reads on the meter, and Scientologists have been indoctrinated, as we said last time, if it reads on the meter, it's true.
And I can tell you a specific story about this. A man I talked with who became involved with Scientology in 1954. And he'd left and joined the independents. And we had a conversation and we were talking about OT3. And he said to me, you know, a lot of us from that period, from the 50s, who saw this new stuff coming out, we looked at OT3 and we thought, this is an absolute nonsense. This is just complete folly. But it read on the meter. And I said, and you trusted the meter. Did you ever think that the meter might not actually be accurate? And at that point, he stopped, and he'd never thought about it. It had never struck him that the instrument of measure they were using might of itself not be accurate. And that reflects on the point you made earlier, which is the meter will read on what you think. It won't read on the truth. It will read also on what you imagine. And those things which you believe, therefore, become relevant. And that throws us into the very definition of hypnosis, which is guiding the imagination. So you start with a man who writes fiction for a living, and he makes a very poor living doing it, but he's very inventive. I mean, Stephen King says that Fear is the greatest short story ever written, you know, which I don't agree with. I'm much more a fan of Chekhov, but nonetheless, whatever we say about his dismal writing style, and it really is appalling. You read a book like Slaves of Sleep, it's like really atrocious. His vocabulary, his way of constructing like sentences is really poor. There's no poetry in the man whatsoever. However, his imagination, his grabbing hold of ideas is very good. So what he does is he tells us you never evaluate for the pre-clear. And then he tells us what you're not going to evaluate about. You're not going to evaluate about engram secondaries and locks, for example, the reactive mind. So you give a framework in which it will work. Then we come to OT3 and you're going, you never evaluate for the pre-clear. He's telling you exactly what happened, when it happened, where it happened. And of course, he's saying it happened in Hawaii and the Canary Islands, which didn't exist 75 million years ago. He's also writing at a time when the Great Extinction is still being vaguely dated at about 75 million years by some people. So that he can grab onto this thing that's in the news that they found that there was this great extinction of the dinosaurs, very popular in the 1960s. Of course, that's now dated, I think, more closely to 60 million years. So we lost that too. But you never evaluate for the pre-clear. No, you evaluate enough so that, as you say, he can bring along his blue kangaroos, develop false memories, and then what you will measure on the emeter is the depth of belief in these imaginings, rather than what is really hampering a person's development. The one thing I can certainly say about Scientology, having met so many, a couple of thousand Scientologists over the years, is that people make very little progress in terms of their compassion and their effectiveness in helping other people to overcome difficulties. They make tremendous progress in becoming more selfish, self-centered, narcissistic, money-grubbing, and addicted to the process of auditing. Those things do happen. But as to them rising up to a level of Buddhahood and compassion, I've not really seen that. I've seen people who left Scientology, like my very good friend Ira Chaleff, for example, who've gone into the world and done amazing positive things, none of them in any way related to Scientology's teachings. In fact, a lot of what Ira has taught came from the negative impact of being around Ron Hubbard, out of which he developed courageous followership, where you've got to stand up to the tyrannical leader and say, no, that's not the way to go. And he's taught ways of doing that. So I've known a few people who've gone into the world after Scientology and done something, but who among them is...
Yeah, the late Jim DeCalci, who we just lost.
Yeah.
Wonderful man, wonderfully loving man. And in some ways, for many people I've met, Scientology was a trip into the underworld.
Yes.
And they emerged from the underworld sadder but wiser for their suffering.
Oh, that's very true. Yeah.
What I wanted to say, when Hubbard says do not evaluate for the pre-clear, he's evaluating for them chronically and habitually. And they may not say, they can say anything they want as long as it's not negative. You could not say David Miscavige is a suppressive person in session and live in Scientology. You'd be escorted out of the building, declared. The other thing that Hubbard's doing, and this is very subtle, he's indoctrinating you into a hard fixed identity called must be a Scientologist in good standing. So while you're getting auditing for your blue kangaroos on the moon, you're becoming a harder, more doctrinaire, hardcore, militant Scientologist.
Oh, they're determined.
Yeah, absolutely, they're determined. I know Scientologists, a woman who was tasked to be a volunteer for Scientology's Office of Special Affairs, and she had to go into a psychiatrist's office pretending to be a new patient. And when she was there in the waiting room, the psychiatrist was there alone in the room with a patient waiting. And she went in and stole files on a particular person they were after. So she actually engaged in commercial burglary, stealing privileged medical information to give to Scientology's Office of Special Affairs. That's what happens while you're getting auditing. I cover in my blog the pervasive and very permissive attitude toward white-collar criminality in the Church of Scientology, which I find absolutely appalling.
Yes.
How much the church itself engages in white-collar criminality with credit card fraud in particular, and other types of fraud, and how much they allow people like the brothers Jeff and Jay Spina, chiropractors, engaged in an $80 million Medicare fraud. Jay Spina's in prison right now. His brother's going to be shortly thereafter. Jay got sentenced for 9 years. Scientologist David Gentili was $1.8 billion Ponzi scheme. He was arrested by the FBI in February 2021 and is facing federal criminal trial. All the civil trials have been stayed. So you're right. There's an indoctrination process going on while you're being audited. And you're allowed to talk about anything you want. And if you originate, and what's interesting, Hubbard says that we are not the police. So if we find out that Joe robbed the bank, he gives that up in session. Joe says, hey, I robbed a bank. Scientology is not going to tell the police that Joe robbed the bank. Say Joe got $52,000 robbing the bank. They're not going to tell the police, but they're going to have that to use against Joe for the rest of his life. And Joe's going to be expected to make a donation to the Church of Scientology. They don't want to know where the money comes from. Or if they do, they don't care.
I have a particular case that I was privy to as I was leaving Scientology. And this was a man who had, he'd sold a product that was cladding spray-on cladding for brick or concrete houses. And I knew three people who'd worked in his company. One of them was a decorator who'd put the cladding on, and he went to him and said, "Why aren't we using the primer for this material?" And the guy said, "Oh, it just costs too much money." And so he offered a lifetime guarantee for the material. Within a year, of course, it was falling off because there was no glue to bind it. The primer wasn't there. This man went to Scientology and said, what am I going to do about this? He'd paid over between £100,000 and £200,000, I believe, to Florida, the Flag Land Base, for himself and his wife. And they said, we think it'd be a good idea if you moved to South Africa. That was the most ethical group in the world. That was because he might ask for the money back if he had to repay anything. And that type of sort of very single-minded thinking, that what's best for the world across the 8 dynamics is whatever is best for Scientology. And so that means you're able, having robbed a bank, to give the money to Scientology, then of course it's a high crime for one Scientologist to report another to the police.
Exactly.
So you've got a closed system wherein this criminality is encouraged. And there are so many confidence tricksters in Scientology, so many of the people who cluster around Flag Land Base. A friend of mine was an artist, and he left Scientology briefly. And then he went back after a few months and, among other things, wrote a report about me. But that's fine. I understand how that happens, and it was not damaging to me. And a year or so later, I was in a supermarket in East Grinstead, and he walked up to me. Now, most Scientologists sort of run away from me because I have these tremendous superhuman powers, this kind of barrier that bounces them off because I'm so incredibly OT. But he walked up to me and said, "Oh, hey, John, how are you doing?" And I said, "I'm fine. It's lovely to see you. How's everything with you?" He said, "Look, I wanted to apologize to you. I went back into Scientology and I did OT8, which is complete nonsense. But I realized that all of my sales were to Scientologists." So he was an artist and he sold his paintings and made a very good living, but he'd not developed any market anywhere else, which he should have been able to do. He's very talented. But and I've met a number of these people over the years who will, they're basically con artists. They're basically people who do not believe in Scientology, but have realized that commercially there is a killing to be made. Another man who was a dreadful con artist, he bought 14 houses, all of them on first mortgages, which meant he got special tax relief. And then when he got caught and went to court, he was being prosecuted, he claimed that he didn't speak English. He was an Israeli, which was completely untrue. He claimed that he hadn't understood the contracts, and he got away with it. Wow. He got away with it. He too one day walked up to me in the street and said, "I've stayed in Scientology because these people are such easy marks."
Wow. Well, there's a lot of Scientologists and Scientologist fraud, con artists, affinity fraud, you would call it. John, pivoting to something else, I want to go back to the body thetans.
Yes, by all means.
So what Ron Hubbard had to do was to stay within an engineering framework that allowed him to stay with the galvanic skin resistance. That's the actual engine of Scientology. That's why he created body thetans. They were copyrighted as a trade secret, because RTC did argue in a court of law that the OT levels were a trade secret.
Yes.
He had an origin point.
I was involved in that case, the first one that they brought that. So yeah,
interesting.
I'm very familiar with that.
Hold that for a minute. So Hubbard can copyright body thetans as a trade secret of Scientology. He creates them, and they all have a birth certificate traceable to incident 2 of OT3. So they have an origin point within Scientology. That's the firewall.
Or the wall of fire, if you like.
Yes, but that's where you can't go back. They can't come from anywhere else. They can't come from anywhere else. Even though in the early 50s, he had targs. He had all these other entities that came from other places. Suddenly OT3 limited body thetans to Xenu's genocide, right? the Zenoodle genocide. And these were only remediable by the emeter NOT3 on up auditing into solo auditing. So from an engineering perspective, he stays within his lane, which is the emeter.
Yeah.
And that's very clever on his part. And because there were trillions of people murdered by Xenu, I calculate the number sometimes, it's in the 80 trillion or something, I forget. You have 76 planets with average population, 80 million, you do the math. So there's an endless supply that everybody has. So he cleverly finds a way to go from engrams to body thetans and to monetize that. And then when you go into solo auditing, which could last. And the interesting thing about the state of clear and the OT levels, when you go clear, it's self-attested. Scientology never tells you that you're clear, you have to self-attest. So Hubbard shifts the burden for going clear onto you, and this is reflected in their contracts. Scientology's contracts say, Ron Hubbard never promised anybody anything. It's just a record of his research, and any results are those that Scientologists claim for themselves. So even though Hubbard makes supernatural, miraculous claims, he shifts the burden of proof onto the Scientologists in his contract language. And this is why I'm saying you have to look at both the metaphysics and the business and legal construct of Scientology. So they'll take your money, but they shift the entire burden of proof onto you. They shift all the burden onto you. They're just saying, look, we have a room you can go into, you're a public, there's a Sea Org member, and they'll audit you, and any results you write up in your success story, you said it, we didn't. And Hubbard said, this is what should happen. If you said it happened, then you self-attest. So it's on you. So it's a very sophisticated metaphysical business construct that is a rigged casino that always goes in favor of the church. The other thing we mentioned on part one of our podcast on the emeter, the emeter began its life as a lie detector or a polygraph in the 1920s. That is really the precursor of the emeter. It began as a lie detector.
Yeah.
And then going earlier, Jung looked at it for psychotherapeutic uses, and as did Volney Mathis, and then Hubbard picked it up. Hubbard, in his paranoid psychopolitics of organization and his view of Scientology against the world, brings the emeter back into its role as a polygraph or a lie detector. That's the other part that a lot of non-Scientologists don't see, that within Scientology, it is used to do security checking as a polygraph or a lie detector.
Yes.
And so Hubbard weaponizes it against Scientologists, and that's why you do sex checks, and they want to find out what your crimes are, what you've done sexually, what you've done with your money. Have you committed a crime that you haven't told us? And Hubbard, in his sex check, in the infamous Johannesburg sex check, the Joburg, he said the only way you can fail this test is by not telling us the truth. So it's interesting that Hubbard, again, betrays himself by basically admitting that it is a lie detector, and he's going to security check you for your lies and crimes.
Yeah.
So it's a psychotherapeutic device on the one hand. Scientology says it's for use for finding and detecting areas of spiritual travail. But they don't say it's also a lie detector. We're going to get everything out of you. We're going to get all your secrets recorded so that if you ever leave us, we can smear you on the internet with what you did. And if there's no crimes there, we'll just make stuff up. So that's what the emeter is. It's that old Saturday Night Live joke about it's both a floor wax and a dessert topping.
Right.
That's the emeter. It's both a psychotherapeutic device to reach into the vast empyrean of the theta universe to find areas of spiritual distress and travail, but it's also a lie detector where we're going to crush you into abject obedience to our will. So you've got to see it functions both ways. It has a duality. as a
And
police device.
that is the very nature of Scientology, that everything is a double bind. Hubbard again and again promotes this notion of the two terminal universe, this simple kind of, I don't know, James Clerk Maxwell view that you've got positive and negative, anode, cathode, everything functions in this way. Well, of course, human beings are a little more sophisticated than that. That there's rather more than that going on in us. But he does, and this for me was a very important thing when I was, most of the blogs that I wrote for Tony Ortega's site, and I wrote nearly about 70 of them, are about recovery, about reframing what the Scientology experience is to understand it, rather than understanding it from the inside, which is impossible to do. You have to step outside of it and see what the construction is. And the fundamental construction is this anode, cathode, positive, negative, so that you have the goals, problems, mass, which is meant to be, these are the things that are meant to hold the reactive mind together. They kind of get skipped over after, by the late 70s, we don't bother with grade 6 or 6. We don't bother with the clearing course all that often. The old OT1 has had the GPM shifted off it. The only time you see it is when you do OT2, and you're suddenly presented with this list of to be or not to be, and imagine a light and a shock and go through these things with no idea of what's going on. I mean, the poor people who did the original clearing course in 65, they spent months, as Hubbard said, digging ditches with no idea where they were going. As you say, generally one attests to clear. The individual says, I've always been clear. That was quite popular for a while in the late 70s, the natural clear. But you say, I have no reactive mind. There is an exception to that. John McMaster, who was named as the world's first real clear by Hubbard, was told by Hubbard, you are clear now. And McMaster went, oh, thank God for that. I don't think I could have stood another day of this nonsense. That two-terminal situation functions throughout Scientology. Almost everything is contradicted. So the emeter is an instrument of liberation and entrapment.
Yes, that's how I would put it. If you have, on the lower grades, especially if you deal with some area of distress and you erase it, if you will, and you feel a sense of liberation, that liberation only makes you more of a Scientologist.
Yeah.
Because it reinforces the idea that I was liberated by Scientology, therefore it makes you more of a Scientologist.
Yeah.
And so that's a good summary overview of the emeter, what it is and does. I wanted to, I got a note from a reader who worked on emeters in the church, in the Sea Org, from 1979 to 2004.
Okay.
Now, you were talking about the $38 emeter, and you were the fellow's name. Who was it?
Well, it was Texas Instruments who gave a quote to the Watchdog Committee.
Oh, yeah.
But I talked about Barry Pemberthy and building a meter from the finest available components. That meter was called the Ability Meter, and it was released in about 1985.
Okay, well, I haven't.
Long gone by now. He's a dear man, a lovely man.
I've got some inside dope to share with your listeners and you.
Okay.
Now, I won't give the fellow's name, but I will put it on my blog, and we'll talk later. He says, this is interesting. In 1979, Ron Clifford ran the Mission HEM finance system. And he says at this time, Hubbard thought the Western world was about to collapse, which was true.
Yes. I want Scientologists to survive World War III. Yeah.
So in 1979, Hubbard gave the order to build 15,600 Mark 6 emeters at one go. That's how many Scientologists were. That's what the need was. There weren't 12 million members.
Oh, yeah.
Hubbard said 15,600 Mark 6 emeters. So the total parts for molding costs were around $2 million. And I worked out a bill of goods, and that sounds about right because molds are very expensive, especially back then. when you didn't have all the CNC equipment and you didn't have everything you had today. So the cost would have actually worked out about $138 per meter. And he says that they used a very expensive pivot and jewel meter, device.
Yeah.
Very expensive piece. And it had very stringent ballast specifications. And it was developed by Barry Penberthy for the Mark V, refined by John McCormick for the 6. Hubbard actually knew he had problems with sloppy emeters, with crap emeters, junk equipment. He knew it. And he gave an order to tighten it up. So we ended up with ridiculously tight tolerances and lots of dropouts. They even had a clean room where they tried with middling success to prepare needle mechanisms. Now, another piece of interest, so they were trying to build a better emeter because Hubbard recognized it was a lot of garbage. And I've taken apart a lot of old emeters. I like to take stuff apart. And a lot of it is crap. I worked with electronics my entire career, and I know what good I was fortunate to work on very quality, professional level electronics, whether it was military, medical, aircraft. I got to work on a lot of really great electronics. But having said that, I would take apart stuff when it broke, consumer electronics, and I would always note the junk that the consumer grade stuff was. That's what I like for stereo. I only ever bought the best. The best Japanese stuff for stereo.
I have a Nakamichi amplifier. What can I say?
A man after my own heart. So, and in terms of your note on germanium transistors, the original OC71 alloy transistor was no longer available, so you switched to the 2N1303, and they still had a lot of dropouts. So,
and then explain to our listeners what a dropout is, what you mean by that. You're not talking about hippies here, obviously.
Well, it gets technical. Basically, it means it doesn't work. You're getting a dropout on signal flow. I'm going to simplify it.
It's failing to read when it should read. Yeah.
So anyway, there are people listening, and we welcome more emails and letters because we want to get more of the history of what really went on, how the emeters were really built. They were hand soldered, which is the worst thing you could do. For a long time, they were hand soldered.
Yeah.
Until Miscavige came up with his warehouse Mark VIII, which was flow soldered on boards. Hand soldering boards is the worst thing you could do because of the inconsistency. Mark Headley relates a story. I think he was 14 or 15. He got put on the line and told to solder. And there's just so many room for errors. But over and above that,
our listeners who use British English, solder is solder. It's pronounced solder in
solder. Very good. And also, one time, my lovely wife Karen, being British, I used the word as an American, penicillin. She goes, no, it's penicillin.
Penicillin.
Which is so much more economical. Americans go, I need penicillin. Or proper Brit would say penicillin. So anyway, this is interesting stuff. But above the actual, the emeters were poorly built. They weren't perfect. Hubbard knew he had a problem. But that didn't matter to Hubbard because he was really indoctrinating people into this militant, paranoid, psychotic organization, right? So the indoctrination became more powerful than the meter. He stayed with embodied thetans to keep it within the engineering envelope of the emeter, because bodied thetans read on the skin. So those are important points. And we have more to talk about. Later on, even though Hubbard in 52 said Scientology was Freudian free association plus the emeter, later on, Hubbard damns Freud to hell, along with all the rest of the psychs, as having come from the planet Far sect to implant and enslave mankind. So with Scientology,
implanting and enslaving people, let's face it.
Yeah. So my point is with Scientology, when someone asks me what Scientology is, it's a moving target. It depends what period of Scientology you're talking about, whether Hubbard was in charge or Miscavige. how good the electronics were or how bad the electronics were. I'm going to leave you with this one thing from the newest patent. We'll wind down part 2, and I think we could go to part 3.
Yep, I think we probably can.
Here's a guilty secret Scientology is not disclosing. As I read the 2012 patent, in which Norman Starkey is the legal representative and Hubbard's the principal inventor. Okay, now, an old meter, you grab the cans, right? And the meter picked that up and it read on the needle, right? Now, do you remember the case of Lisa McPherson, a horrible case?
Of course, yes.
David Miscavige was case supervising her,
yep.
according to what we are told.
Yes.
And after Lisa's horrendous death, which was negligent homicide on the church's part, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, if
Marty
anybody
Ruffin,
doesn't know about this case, Lisa McPherson was a Scientologist who was committed to a psychiatric institute, having had a manic incident, and she was taken from the institute by Scientologists. She died not long afterwards of dehydration, and there were ligature marks on her wrists and on her ankles. She'd been tied up, and she had not been provided with water.
It was a murder. And Scientology spent $100 million to get the coroner to change the verdict.
Yeah.
After this, David Miscavige changed the definition of the floating needle, which could be for our next part 3. So that he changed the definition of the floating needle. But Miscavige later did something more sinister in his warehouse Mark 7. And it was built prior to 2012, and it sat in a warehouse for years. But you know the Reed simulator? There's something in Scientology called the Reed simulator, because an emeter will have reeds. They'll move in different ways. So you have a rock slam, a long fall blowdown, floating needle, etc.
Theta bop,
all those things. Now they have a device called the Reed simulator, so that if I were training you to run a meter, or you were training me, you would switch a dial, and I would have to look at the needle read on my side and tell you what the read was.
Yep.
I say, oh, that was a theta bop. Say, correct. I'd have to know in order to be an auditor, I have to know what all the different spasms of the needle are, correct?
Yep.
Now this read simulator is based on a chip that's a lookup chart. So if I hit theta bop, semiconductor will look at the software and say, here's how I emulate it. Correct?
Yep.
Because Miscavige doesn't trust auditors, the newer meter has that same lookup chart and it interpolates. So you're not getting a straight hand-to-candle meter. You're getting it going through looking for nearest closest value on a lookup chart. So that's one of the secrets of the new meter, is it interpolates. Whereas the old meter, you were getting this straight through. Now there's a via, which is a little bit of sleight of hand on Miscavige's part, showing that he wants to tighten it up. And so there's a little bit of dishonesty in it, I think, on their latest patent. And maybe in our next episode we could talk about the new meter and what's happens in the Miscavige era, especially with Golden Age of Tech phase 1 forward. I think that might be interesting to talk about how Scientology was changed, not only in terms of the e-meter, but the approach to the e-meter within the church under Miscavige versus Hubbard. That would be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I agree. I have made a couple of notes, which I just want to round up here. I think I heard you use the word zenoodle.
Yes.
And I'd like to accept that into the English language immediately, because of the possibilities of zenoodling.
The zenoodle genocide.
Yeah, the zenoodle genocide. That's just wonderful, and I thank you for that. The second point is that Hubbard is the victim as well as the perpetrator of all of this. That when Virginia Downsborough went to him in 1966 at his desperate request in Las Palmas, Gran Canaria, I interviewed Virginia twice. And she said that this is where OT3 has emerged, and he's been there on his own. She said he was living on a shelf full of drugs and held her hands up like that, was never able to prize out of her what those drugs were. I can guess there would have been amphetamines, barbiturates, and an opiate drug called Demerol, which he was quite keen on. He was no longer eating. And she said he was completely out of his mind. He'd scribbled all of these notes, and he was telling her the body thetans have taken over, I can't resist them, and all of this. So we don't have a man who's calmly and calculatedly worked this out. We have a man who's enmeshed and caught in this himself. And at the end of his life, when he talks to Sarge Fouth, as recorded by Lawrence Wright in Going Clear, he again says, I failed, that the entities have taken over. So he was a man of a very fragile state of mind. The other and final point that I'd like to make, what I came to was a perception of Scientology that for a while, the book that's now called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which remains the only history of Scientology, sadly. I'm hoping that Chris Owen will, or somebody brilliant, Tony Ortega Chris Shelton will update it at some point. Maybe you will. I don't know. I'm not going to, though people keep asking me to. But it was at one point called Hubbard Through the Looking Glass, because my revelation about Scientology is it is the opposite of what it says it is. So where Hubbard says he is liberating, he is entrapping. Where Hubbard talks about implanting and that he is releasing people from implants, and the whole idea of OT3 and all of this is that we've been implanted at some point and we helplessly follow these routines that have been put into us. No, the reality is that Scientology is a very sophisticated form of implanting. And the final part of that is that the promise of Scientology is that you will become self-determined. And the reality is that you will only be self-determined when you agree absolutely with L. Ron Hubbard.
Yes.
Which is not in fact possible because he contradicts himself at every turn. So it's a morass. It's a way of doing the opposite of what it says. And to have that realization, that is the cognition of Scientology. My last auditing session, which you reminded me of along the way, in December 1983, still believing just about, I'd found out about Hubbard, I was a bit worried about him, but I had attested to completion of OT5. My auditor was flag trained, NOTS auditor, OT5 auditor. My supervisor was a flag trained NOTS case supervisor. So there was no doubt about this. They knew what they were doing. They'd been the people doing it at St. Hill. Now they were doing it as independents. And I said, having attested to OT5 and said, I never had any body thetans. It simply isn't true. I was tricked into believing this. It's a deception. I'm very interested in it, but it's not true. And even from the basis that I was a natural clear, I wasn't here when it happened, So if you're a natural clear, it means you've never had the reactive mind. So there was nothing for the body thetans to stick to. I had no body thetans. And having attested that, I said, but there is one thing in 9 years in Scientology I've never had, and that's a PTS rundown. Pretty much everybody else I know has had them. Why haven't I had one? It's so unfair. And Steve Bisbee, who was the CS, Warwick Belmain, who was the auditor, to give me a PTS rundown. And I had no understanding of what I was going to say. I just knew there was something I needed to say about this. And she asked me whatever the first question is about who'd been suppressing me. And I'd not thought about it. In that moment, I went, L. Ron Hubbard. And she went white. So you can't say that, but she couldn't say, you can't say that. And so she said, well, could it be anybody else? And I said, look, I could sit here till doomsday and recite all the people who've been unpleasant to me. But the suppressive on my case is Ron Hubbard. It's only a year later that it clicked that Scientology is L. Ron Hubbard making you a potential trouble source. And you've always been, as far as L. Ron Hubbard is concerned, a potential trouble source. Because at any moment, you might realize that he's actually a suppressive. I had a letter from Richard DeMille, who wrote Science of Survival and two of the other early Scientology books under Hubbard's direction. He didn't come up with the material, but he wrote the actual text of those books, which is why Science of Survival is so much better written than any of the other science. It's not just a bunch of fragments thrown together.
Yeah.
It's actually coherent. It's what convinced me to join Scientology. DeMille, after leaving Scientology, became a professor of psychology at the University of California, I think at Santa Barbara. And he wrote to me out of the blue and he said, yours is the best book about Scientology, which was very gratifying because you're the only person who realizes that the only suppressive person is Ron Hubbard. And that's where he goes to.
Amazing. And I would just add this. I think that the true EP, the true end phenomena of Scientology would have to be the realization I am no longer at cause over my own life.
Yes. I am the effect of L. Ron Hubbard.
Exactly. And just with this little thing, Mary Sue Hubbard, after she was made a non-person in Scientology, she was getting auditing up at Chislehurst, right up the street from Karen and I's home, where she was living in exile.
Yeah.
Been exiled to a home in Los Feliz, California. She said that David Miscavige was the suppressive on her lines. And when Neville Potter gave her this report, he flipped out. He couldn't have it. As a Scientologist, you're supposed to have or experience anything. David Miscavige could not have that Mary Sue called him an SP.
Couldn't confront it.
Because he knew he was a classic SP.
Yeah, and he's done nothing but suppress people, you know.
But look, in Mary Sue's defense, it read on the emeter, so it must be true, David Miscavige. I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jeff. Thank you so much. And I'm still John Atack, and despite everything, all of my body thetans, what have you. And thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, John.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.